All right, let's talk about the Taliban. They're easily one of the most significant, and for sure one of the most controversial, groups on the world stage today.
You probably remember this, right? It was all over the news in the summer of 2021. The world just watched, pretty much in shock, as the Taliban just swept across Afghanistan. They took city after city, and then boom, they were in Kabul. Just like that, they were back in power after a 20-year war. It was a moment that really stunned everyone. So, to really get a grip on what's happening now, we've got to rewind. We need to go back to the beginning. Who are the Taliban, really? Where did they come from? And maybe the biggest question of all, how did they manage to take control of a country of almost 40 million people, not just once, but twice?
Well, their name actually gives us a pretty big clue. Taliban, it's a word in Pashto, and it literally means students. And that's exactly who they were at the start. Religious students from southern Afghanistan and across the border in Pakistan, who all came together to form this movement back in the early 90s. Okay, so this group didn't just appear out of nowhere. You have to understand they were essentially born from the wreckage of two huge, devastating wars. First, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the absolutely brutal civil war that came right after. So picture this, the Soviets pull out, and by 1992, the government they left behind just collapses. Afghanistan spirals into this horrific civil war, with different warlords carving up the country. It was total chaos. And right in the middle of all that, in 1994, the Taliban emerge out of Kandahar. Their big promise? We'll bring back order, we'll get rid of the corruption, and you know what? It worked. In just 2 years, they'd captured Kabul and were running the country. Now, to really get the Taliban, you have to get what they believe. And it's basically this mashup of two really powerful ideas. First, you've got this very, very strict, old-school interpretation of Islamic law called Deobandi fundamentalism. And then you mix that with Pashtun Wali, which is the ancient tribal code for the Pashtun people. It's all about things like honor, hospitality, and crucially, revenge. This mix is the key. It shapes everything they do.
So what happens when you put that ideology into practice? Well, from 1996 to 2001, we found out. They established what they called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and they immediately started to reshape the entire country to fit their vision.
And life under their rule? It was governed by an incredibly harsh set of prohibitions. We're talking about banning most music, TV, even things like flying kites. Men had to grow their beards out, but the most extreme rules were reserved for women. They were essentially erased from public view, banned from going to school, from working most jobs, and forced to wear a full-body burqa if they ever left the house.
And this quote from their founder, Mullah Omar, really gives you a window into their thinking. Remember the Buddhas of Bamiyan? These incredible 1,500-year-old statues carved into a cliffside? Well, in 2001, the whole world was begging them not to, but they destroyed them anyway. Why? Because in their view, they were idols. It was a shocking act of cultural destruction.
But that first time in power, it came to a very sudden, very abrupt end, and it forced them to completely transform, from being the government to being back on the run as a guerrilla army.
The year everything changed was, of course, 2001. After the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. discovered al-Qaeda had been operating from Afghanistan. The Taliban were sheltering Osama bin Laden. So, a U.S.-led invasion came in, and very quickly, the Taliban government was toppled. But that was nowhere near the end of the story. The war that started then would go on for 20 years. It became America's longest ever war, lasting all the way until the final withdrawal of foreign troops in 2021. So for 2 whole decades, the Taliban just kept fighting. They waged this relentless insurgency. They kind of melted away from the big cities, but they regrouped in the mountains and the countryside and over the border in Pakistan. And from there, they fought a classic guerrilla war against the new Afghan government and, let's not forget, some of the most powerful armies on the planet. And that brings us right back to the present day. The insurgency worked. The Taliban are back in charge. But, winning a war is one thing. Actually governing a country, that's a whole different ballgame. And their new government is facing a mountain of challenges. For starters, it's not like they're all one big happy family. The Taliban is actually split into different factions. You've got the old guard from Kandahar, the original heartland of the movement. They're more traditional, more inwardly focused. But then you have the Haqqani network, which is way more connected to international groups and controls key things like security. These two groups are constantly jockeying for power, which makes it hard for them to get anything done. Then there's the money problem. I mean, it's a huge one.
As soon as the Taliban took power, the rest of the world basically hit the brakes. International aid, which had been paying for something like 80% of the old government's budget, was cut off. Afghanistan's assets were frozen. The result, an absolute economic catastrophe and a massive humanitarian crisis.
Now, when they first came back, they made all these promises about being more moderate this time around. But when it comes to women's rights, they've pretty much gone back to the old playbook. They shut down the Ministry of Women's Affairs, they've banned girls from going to high school or university, and they've stopped women from working in most jobs. It's a systematic dismantling of their rights.
So, you add all this up, and what do you get? A pretty predictable result, really. Afghanistan today is a nation almost totally isolated from the rest of the planet.
Just how isolated are they? Well, think about this. Out of 193 countries in the United Nations, only one officially recognizes their government. That kind of isolation is absolutely devastating, not just for the government, but for the everyday people of Afghanistan trying to survive.
And as if an economic collapse and humanitarian crisis weren't enough, they're also fighting off armed enemies inside the country. The biggest threat right now is from ISIS-K, the local branch of the Islamic State. These guys are even more extreme, and they're constantly launching attacks against Taliban targets and tragically against civilians too.
Which really leaves us with the million-dollar question for Afghanistan's future. The Taliban have proven, twice now, that they are incredible fighters. They know how to win a war. But can they actually govern with a shattered economy, with the whole world shunning them, and with enemies inside their own borders? It's a huge open question, and the answer is going to determine the fate of millions of people.